And welcome back to Getting In, a college coach conversation. I'm here with Jean Mahan and Sally Ganga today, and we are talking about The Price You Pay for College by Ron Lieber. If you want to know what the cover of the book looks like, you can go to our Facebook page and watch this on video. We're having a great conversation. In fact, a great conversation that spilled over into the break. And now we're back to talk to you about the next segment. And I want to just get into part two, which I thought was such a great decision by Lieber in terms of how he engages with this book. He's got part two is called The Unhelpful Feelings You May Feel. And he has a separate chapter dedicated to fear, guilt, and the pull of snobbery and elitism. And I just want to open it up. I don't know if either of you want to tackle one of those powerful, unhelpful feelings and your reaction to the inclusion here in this section.
I thought it was so great that he addressed it head on. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to be a factor in almost every, not all, but almost every conversation that I have. And I felt like he gave me some additional vocabulary even to work with. Like, I want to go back and read it over. I mean, the other day I was talking to a father and he said, well, my daughter doesn't want to go any place where she has to explain what the school is. Like, people have to have heard of it. And I said, okay, well, how much impact do you think that's actually going to have on our day-to-day in the college? What sort of advantages and disadvantages? I mean, I sort of took him through and he said, yeah, but this is what she wants. And I said, well, do you think this is a higher priority than smaller class sizes? Do you think she'll do better in a smaller classroom? He said, yeah, she's always like talking to her teacher, and so I said, do you think maybe you could guide her towards thinking about this a little differently? But he was so like, no, this is what she wants. And I said, well, can we push back on this a little?
Yeah, I think what a student wants, what a kid wants, we don't always give them. And I think with respect to that, especially that pull of I want people to know where I'm going to school. Everything about your world is so much more narrow when you're in high school. When you go to college, are you really going back and connecting with your hometown for the rest of your life to talk to all of your former high school classmates about where you went to school? And very rarely, I think, is that the case. Your world sort of opens up based on where you go to college. And so having that tension of, I really want to be impressive among this population of my current high school peers misses the growth that you're likely to experience when you go off to school.
And I have to say, I think it's very understandable that a high school student only knows that, but I do have to push back on parents. Yeah, I mean, I thought my high school was the center of the universe, right? So, sure. I mean, of course it was. That's where I went to college, but like, parents know. And so I really do want parents to feel empowered to push back. And having grown up, I personally, my experience was with a mother who was very, very capable of saying, Sally, you're really wrong about that. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about. She could have been a little gentler sometimes, but she was right quite a bit. And as a result, we had some really useful conversations about college.
Yeah.
Right.
Are there particular things in here, Jean, that you find are showing up, whether it's fear or guilt or this pull of elitism, that come up more frequently than others?
All of them. All of them do. Yeah. And I love too that he answered, had a whole section about this. I love this book, but I think I particularly loved that because it really brought it to the front. People don't want to talk about it. And I recently spoke to a woman on the phone and she said, when was the last time someone had a wine and cheese party and invited you over to talk about college costs and what their kids were getting for financial aid packages? Never. And so I said to her, maybe you should be the one to start that, little party and gathering so that people do feel more empowered to ask about, what are you getting and what should I be thinking about? But I do often, more often than I wish, hear parents say, I hate to dash their dreams, their hopes. They may not be successful if they don't go to XYZ school. And so sometimes I'll just turn that back on the parent and say, well, where did you go to college? And do you feel successful? And oftentimes it wasn't at Harvard or Stanford. It was maybe a state college, not even a state university, but a smaller state college, a smaller private school. Think about that. And, just because something has name power doesn't necessarily mean it's a great fit for your student.
Mhm.
So I think parents should really be, and we're going to be talking about this a little later, is, having the talk about as early as 8th grade, really talking about college is going to be coming in a few years. Let's think about that. Let's talk about how we're going to pay for it because it's expensive, and what we expect of each one of us. Do we expect that mom and dad are paying for it, or grandparents are helping, or you're going to get a job and help out? So yeah, I think that's really important, and everyone's then on the same page. I don't want any family anywhere to put their financial footing on sand to make this happen.
Mhm.
And I have people that will tell me, I can't afford this, so I'm just going to borrow. Well, you pay now or you pay later. It's just, you're still going to pay for it. And so it makes me so sad to hear this. And just like Ian, would you give one of your kids a lollipop for breakfast? Maybe once in a while, but not every day.
Mhm.
And so my parents were also very good, Sally, at saying no to me. Because I was the oldest of a large family, no is the word I knew best. And so, I think that we have to be more honest and upfront with our kids and say, this is what we can afford. We have 3 other children in this family we have to educate. We have X number of dollars, and we have to retire someday. And unless you're planning to support us in that endeavor, then we have limited financing.
Mhm. I think though that we need to, where I am very sympathetic too, is the fear element, right?
Yes.
I mean, especially when we work, we often work with immigrants who have come from colleges where really the system is quite rigid. I think we need to acknowledge that too, that like in France, it's just a country I know a little bit more about. If you haven't gone to certain colleges, you really aren't going to get certain jobs. I mean, I think the mobility is changing and improving quite a bit. And at this point, they have more mobility than we do in general, but they're coming from systems where really, if you don't go to one of these named colleges, your opportunities will be extremely limited. And so it's such a, so that fear is something that I'm sympathetic to, and I work really, really hard to address it. And I'm glad that he addresses it in here, while acknowledging that there are some industries, finance being ridiculously snobby. I mean, seriously, do they want everybody to think the same way? Like, if anybody who works in finance is listening to this, I'm talking to you. You should not be hiring from like 20 schools.
That's Sally Ganga, Ganga.
Well, seriously, like, do you want a bunch of people who all think the same? I think that's what you want, since you're only recruiting from certain schools. But that's like 1%, or that's less than 1%. It's such a tiny fraction. So that's where you can really be reassuring, is that it doesn't, most industries are just so much more open than people realize.
I think you're right. I also, as a parent, who has basically, my daughter was just under a year old when I started working at College Coach. My son was born when I was at College Coach. And so I've been around college finance experts basically their entire lives. And I think there is an element of fear of, well, I'm putting into a 529, but is it enough? Is it going to give them enough opportunity? What will the cost of college be when my 9-year-old daughter enters as a freshman? What kind of opportunities are available to her? And I've been saving. I mean, I wonder whether it needs to be more all the time. And there's that element of fear. But I even think about families where maybe they're new to that conversation and their student is 9 years old. And it reminds me of, not getting started on your homework until really late. And it gets worse and worse, the snowballing effect of continuing to put it off and continuing to not get started because you're just so anxious that it hasn't already been done. I would put in a big plug for all of our listeners. Most of the listeners that come to this show, you've got students in high school. You're thinking about the decisions about where to apply and where to go to school. If you have family friends who have younger kids who are in kindergarten, in elementary school, this is a great book for them to get a chance to put their hands on too, because it talks about saving over time and different ways you can make decisions to be in the best position going forward. So I'd recommend it for those families as well. Sally, I love what you mentioned about the, the different the different kind of professions and where they recruit from. I also wanted to call out, I put it in a margin here, exactly the study that was on here. And I've been quoting it for a long time that I've been here. It was the Kruger study. I don't remember. Oh, there it was, Dale Kruger. But it was a Dale Kruger study, and it basically was looking at earnings of people who went to highly selective institutions versus people who went to less selective institutions. But both groups of students got into the highly selective. They just made different decisions about where they wanted to go. And over time, they found that the career earnings of those two groups were essentially indistinguishable. And I think that that's a really clear indication that in many circumstances, it's about the student and that student success that determines their success, later on down the road, and not where they go to school.
Yes.
And that's different than it is in other countries. And I think it's different from what our assumptions are about college as well.
Exactly. I do think we need to call out, and I was glad that he mentioned this, that this is especially the case for white men. Right. If you are a person of color, especially from an underrepresented group, and even women, there is, and I was so surprised, like as a white woman, really, but it seems to be that women in general, there is a little bit of, it is sort of more important to go to one of those more prestigious schools. I don't think it's the mobility effects. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to note though, too, is that when people talk about prestige, I think they're all thinking about the Ivies, and he's talking about like McAllister. I mean, I think he'd include Reed in that, even though a lot of people haven't heard of Reed. Like that's where I went. A lot of people haven't heard of it, but enough people have, so that's another thing that I want to point out. That it's even he, when he's talking about prestige, is not just talking about the Ivies.
That's a great point.
Adjacent.
I think people think about top 10, top 25, but when he's talking about prestige, it's like top 200, the top 10%, top 300 schools. And I think when people talk about the highly ranked schools, we always focus on this very small sliver of them, even though there are many schools that are highly ranked. And his point is, you don't even need to go to one of those top 10%. There are also these other great institutions out there as well. Jean, did you look like you wanted to add something in about that section? I don't know if I.
So, what you said about it's more about the student, I must say that 50 times a week, because, I mean, sometimes someone will say, well, my kid got into an honors program at our state university and got a scholarship, but he really wants to go to the XYZ university where we got no scholarship money and we're paying full price. And, really to look deeper into that. I mean, I've known some people who have just really shined in that environment, and have done really, really well. And I often talk about, getting experiences. So, I'm coming at this because I was a French major, and I have two children who majored in history and peace and justice studies, and not typically, you would think highly sought after, but they also worked and got experiences when they were in school. And so there's nothing wrong with being an English major, an art history major. Maybe you want to work on the school newspaper. Maybe you want to be working, do an internship at a museum or with a gallerist or something like that. Those are all things that you can then bring to somebody and say, this is my experience. I haven't just been sitting around in school, reading Jane Eyre for the last 4 years. I've actually been doing something. And, back in the day, a lot of companies, big companies, offered management training programs. So they plucked you out of school. It didn't matter whether you were majoring in French or English or chemistry, and they put you into their training programs and they taught you. And, that's something that can still happen, even with an English degree. You can get into a business where they know that you can read, can write, can think critically. They're going to, teach you how to do the job that they want you to do.
And back to that point from the first segment about how consumer attitudes are driving changes within higher ed, I think we're finding that schools that are traditional liberal arts and sciences colleges are bringing in career services. They're helping with resume development. They're having interview days. They are putting that aspect of the education front and center for all students. And I think it is important to consider, well, I might go for the learning experience, or I'm going to find my people, but I also need to acknowledge that part of the goal of my education is to be gainfully employed after I graduate and to have a fulfilling career in whatever way I can.
Right.
We've got a couple of seconds here, but I just want to acknowledge there is this part 3 I thought was really cool. And is totally worth picking up if you are a parent of a student who's in their sophomore or junior year. He talks about things that are worth paying for and has different categories, including classrooms where teachers want to teach, schools where students learn, peers worth being friends with, women's colleges, honors colleges. And there's a lot of cool stuff in there that he looks at from both sides. So he doesn't just say honors colleges are great, find them. He says, here's where they might be great, here's where they might be not so great, and how to ask the questions to figure some of that stuff out. So there's some really great guidance in here about how to actually research colleges that I was not expecting from this book, but I think turned out to be really nice.
And that's one of the real strengths of this book, is that he does show both sides of the coin. He's not just saying, do it this way. He's giving you things to think about. So you can think about it from this standpoint, but you also might want to think about these issues as well. And that's why I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads.
And you can find Gene on Goodreads. No, I'm just kidding. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the final part of the book, planning, thinking about how to actually make the rubber hit the road when it comes to paying for college, and just some final reactions that we all have about the book and things we want you to check out. So don't go away. We'll be right back.